You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi everyone, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This week's episode is a book review, and the book I'm reviewing is called Escape From Childhood by John Holt. I read this book a while ago, and it's one of the books that I find I still think about some of the ideas in it. And I think of it especially because it's a book about parenting, and we now have a daughter. It's a short book, it's really well written. It's a joy to read something by a writer like John Holt, because he writes very clearly, and he writes in a way that it's obvious he wants readers to understand his ideas. He's not one of these pretentious writers who uses convoluted language so you can't tell what they're really saying. He writes very clearly, and it's a real pleasure to read. It's a challenging book. I find John Holt to be a challenging thinker. Even when I disagree with him, I do respect him though. So I'll just tell you a bit about John Holt and the book to start off with. John Holt lived from 1923 to 1985. He was a writer, an educator, a lecturer. He was the author of the book Instead of Education, which I've actually done a podcast about in the past, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. For many years, he was a leading figure in the school reform movement. He became increasingly interested in how children learn outside school, what Holt called unschooling. And the magazine he created, called Growing Without Schooling, which was published from 1977 until 2001, helped found the modern homeschooling movement. So John Holt was really one of the key figures behind the whole idea of homeschooling and unschooling. And he wrote a lot about the problems of compulsory education. But this book, Escape from Childhood, is a much broader book. And in this book, what he wanted to do was to provide his view of what is wrong with the way that we see children and the way that we treat children. So it's much broader than just his criticism of schooling. Here he's talking really about how we view children as a whole and how that fundamental attitude towards children leads to some of the other problems that we can see in things like schooling. So what, in John Holt's view, is the problem with the way that adults treat children? Well, here's a quote for what he says about it. He says, "Most people who believe in the institution of childhood as we know it see it as a kind of walled garden in which children, being small and weak, are protected from the harshness of the world outside until they become strong and clever enough to cope with it. Some children experience childhood in just that way. I do not want to destroy their garden or kick them out of it. If they like it, by all means let them stay in it. But I believe that most young people, at earlier and earlier ages, begin to experience childhood not as a garden, but as a prison. What I want to do is put a gate or gates into the wall of the garden, so that those who find it no longer protective or helpful, but instead confining and humiliating, can move out of it and for a while try living in a larger space. If that proves too much to them, they can always come back into the garden. Indeed, perhaps we all ought to have walled gardens to take refuge in when we feel we must." So what Holt's saying is that most children, a lot of the time, can feel as if childhood is a kind of prison. And the reason that they feel that way, according to him in this book, is essentially because children are treated as objects for meeting the needs of their parents, by their parents. Essentially, the way that children get treated are either as slaves or as pets. And what he's also saying is that whereas children previously, in historical times, had more connection to the outside world, they were more involved in the working world, and they were more connected to the rest of society. He's making the argument in this book that now that children are no longer forced to work and have gained, to some extent, some more material security within the home and within their families, they're now much more cut off from the outside world psychologically. So their worlds really do revolve around them being treated as objects in the world of the adults. Holt says, "Children, for as far back as we know, have always been owned and controlled by adults. What is both new and bad about modern childhood is that children are so cut off from the adult world." And the argument that he's making about why them being cut off from the adult world is bad is because they then are stuck in this sort of bubble prison of being treated kind of like the pet or slave of the adults who control them. So here's the way that he puts it. He says, "Children may not be able anymore to do much of the work of the family or add to its income, but at least for a while, they do give the adults of the family something that most adults need very much: someone to boss, someone to, quote, help, someone to love. For a very long time, ever since men formed societies in which some people bossed others, children have fulfilled this very important function. Every adult parent, however lowly or powerless, had at least someone that he could command, threaten, and punish. No man was so poor, even a slave, that he did not have these few slaves of his own. Today, when most, quote, free men feel like slaves, having their own homegrown slaves is very satisfying. Many could not do without them, end quote. And this is this sort of psychological critique of the way that adults treat children that John Holt is bringing forward in this book. He's basically saying adults treat children like objects. They're either love objects or help objects, or they can be hate objects. But the important point is they're not treated with the dignity of being individuals. And he goes on in the book to explain the many ways that this harms children. So, for example, when he talks about the way that parents and adults treat children as love objects, he's making the point that people essentially use children for their own emotional satisfaction. And I'm not talking about sexual abuse. Of course, that is a significant problem and a much bigger problem than a lot of people know about or understand or are willing to acknowledge. But in this book, John Holt is actually talking about using children as love objects more in the sense of just the emotional satisfaction of the adult who wants to have like a toy, like a pet to love. The way that John Holt puts it is, the person who says how much he loves children may only and really be saying how much he needs to be loved by children, may want from them the kind of uncritical, undemanding, unconditional, total love a baby wants from its mother. He may want to reverse the roles, make himself the child and the children his parents, have them give him what no one else has ever given him. He may seek in children the ideal lover of his dreams. And the point that Holt's making in this book is that when you treat children like that, it has a terribly damaging effect on their characters, on their souls. Because what it does is it teaches children that relationships are about manipulation and about using other people for your own ends. And John Holt describes how once children understand that their parents are using them to meet their own emotional needs, then children can get stuck in that game of playing up to what the parents' needs are. And that's what happens when children start being cutesy and performing, essentially, for their parents. It's a kind of game. They know that's how they get rewards, is by fulfilling their parents' needs. This is the way that John Holt describes it. He says, much of this calculating and game playing is unconscious, goes on at various emotional or gut levels, but if it goes on very long, if the child cannot escape from these games, these mutual exploitations of need, they will surely destroy his character. Such a cute child soon learns to do almost everything he does, at least around adults, to get an effect. He becomes self-conscious, artful, calculating, manipulative. He pays more and more attention to how he appears in the eyes of others, becomes more and more concerned with others' opinions of him. He goes on to say, to sum up, when we think of children as cute, we abstract and idealize them, judge them, exploit them, and worst of all, teach them to exploit us and each other, to sell themselves for smiles and rewards. This is in every way bad for them and for their relations with us. So that's his idea of the way that adults treat children as love objects. He also describes them as help objects. And the idea here is that basically adults get a kick out of children being helpless because it makes the adults feel good. Here's John Holt again. He says, we tend to think that children are most cute when they're openly displaying their ignorance and incompetence. We value their dependency and helplessness. They are help objects as well as love objects. Children acting really competently and intelligently do not usually strike us as cute. They are likely to puzzle and threaten us. Children do not like being incompetent any more than they like being ignorant. They want to learn how to do, and do well, the things that they see being done by bigger people around them. This is why they soon find school such a disappointment. They so seldom get a chance to learn anything important or do anything real. But many of the defenders of childhood, in and out of school, seem to have this vested interest in the children's incompetence, which they often call, quote, letting the child be a child, unquote. as well as talking about the way that parents and adults treat children as love objects and help objects. He also talks about how they treat them as hate objects. Holt says, "The family home, which we often hear described as a place where you're free to be and dare to be nicer and kinder than we can be anywhere else, turns out much of the time to be the place where, at least to our children, we can be harsher, more cruel, more contemptuous and insulting than we would be anywhere else. This supposed refuge for the young becomes the place of greatest danger, where they can get into more and worse trouble than anywhere else, and with people whose support and protection they most depend on." And Holt goes on to talk about things like people smacking children and their attitudes towards corporal punishment. And he points out that a lot of people actually want to see children hit more because they think that is a good thing. It's really treating children as hate objects. It's a kind of sadism. So that's the background, the context of the problem with the way that adults and parents in particular treat children that Holt wants to identify in this book. And that's why he sees childhood as a kind of prison for children a lot of the time, in the way that people currently treat children. And he talks in this book again about schooling, which is his real strong point, and about how compulsory schooling is very much like prison. Forcing children into compulsory schooling is something that we would never accept for ourselves as adults. And basically, he sees it as a civil rights violation of the rights of children. Here's how Holt puts it. He says, "When we put into our laws the highly authoritarian notion that someone should and could decide what all young people were to learn, and beyond that could do whatever might seem necessary, which now includes dosing them with drugs, to compel them to learn it, we took a long step down a very steep and dangerous path. The requirement that a child go to school for about 6 hours a day, 180 days a year, for about 10 years, whether or not he learns anything there, whether or not he already knows it, or could learn it faster or better somewhere else, is such a gross violation of civil liberties that few adults would stand for it. But the child who resists is treated as a criminal. With this requirement, we created an industry, an army of people whose whole work was to tell young people what they had to learn and to try and make them learn it." I found all of that critique of people's attitudes towards children really thought-provoking, really insightful, and well worth reading. There are some things in the book that I was less interested in. In particular, the next section, after that sort of theoretical background, is a section on sort of political proposals that John Holt has. He has a number of suggestions for political and legal children's rights. And some of them seem very sensible to me. For example, he thinks children should have the right to earn money and have the right to own property, and that those rights should be protected in the law. And the other suggestions that he had, I don't agree with. For example, he thinks children should have a guaranteed income funded by the state, and he thinks children should have the right to vote. But I did find it interesting to see his thoughts. I will say that this political section of the book is the most dated part, because there's a lot of stuff that's very linked towards what was going on in the 1970s when he wrote this book. So it's probably the most dated part of the book. But you can read it for yourself. You may find it more relevant than I did. What I did particularly like, though, is that after making these political suggestions, John Holt comes back to talking about what you can do in your own life, regardless of whether or not there are any legal changes to the status of children, what you can do in the way that you treat children to help them live a more free and fulfilled life in their early years. And he talks about the idea that if you want to create a better world, one way that you can do that is to act in your own life as if that world already existed. If you think people should behave differently towards each other, act and behave differently yourself, and you make a part of that world come true in your own life, which is the place where you really can make a difference. So what is John Holt's alternative approach to how to treat children? Obviously, he's criticizing this idea of treating children as if they were kind of slaves or pets or toys or love objects, help objects, hate objects. So what is John Holt's approach? And here is a really beautiful section that I want to read out to you, which summarizes his alternative approach. It's at the end of the book. He's talking about what can we do in our own lives to treat children differently. So here's the quote. He says, "We can begin by trying to be courteous to them. This will be very difficult for those who have been taught by experience only to be servile to the strong and rude and bossy to the weak, or those who have learned to think of children as love objects and to treat them as they would a favorite dog or cat. For to be courteous, we must first of all respect the other person's dignity and sense of self. We must treat him with a certain formality and reserve until we find out how he would like to be treated. We must respect not just his physical, but his emotional life space until he shows us how far into that space he is ready to welcome us. And though being courteous means much more than merely being polite, it means at least that. So we must try to learn to say please or excuse me or thank you to children, and in the same tone of voice that we would use to anyone else. We must not treat a child like a servant and demand from them favours or services that we would not think of asking of someone our own age. Indeed, because he is new in this world and gets his sense of it from how we behave towards him, we would do well to show him extra courtesy, like the wise parents who said to me once that most of the time they tried to behave towards their then 4-year-old son as if he were a very distinguished visitor from a strange and alien civilization, knowing little but eager to learn about how we do things here. End quote. I think that model of how to treat children is really beautiful. The idea that one should behave towards children as if they were a very distinguished visitor from an alien civilization, knowing little but eager to learn about how we do things here. Our daughter was born 8 weeks ago, so we're just in the beginning of this process of being parents. But an analogy that works for me in terms of what my role is as a parent is I feel like this experience is a bit like entering the hospitality business. My wife and I now run a boutique hotel for one guest. And that one guest, we are going to treat like a very distinguished guest. Admittedly, one who doesn't understand the ways of this world yet, but one who wants to learn, who we can help to learn. And I really like that story from John Holt's book about the couple that treated their child as if he was a distinguished visitor from an alien civilization. I think that's a very sweet way of looking at it. So I hope you found that interesting. That was my review of Escape from Childhood. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. You can get it in ebook format quite cheaply on Amazon, and you can find it in various places online as well. That's all for this week. I'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you have feedback about the show, please email jake@thevoluntarylife.com. If you enjoyed this program, please share the podcast with your friends or click the donate button on thevoluntarylife.com.